financial markets in turmoil.
What are the root causes of the financial crisis?
The dollar losing value.
Heading for its biggest loss in nearly 3 decades.
Will Social Security even be there?
I don't know.
Buy or rent?
That's a very good question.
Interest rates.
I'm not so sure.
Where do you put your money?
I don't know.
Welcome to the show that answers your questions. This is Follow the Money Weekly with your host, economist, and best-selling author. Here's Jerry Robinson.
Friends, welcome to this week's edition of Follow the Money Weekly. So glad that you're joining us all around the world. Well, this is our final show of 2014. Hard to believe, isn't it? Got 2 weeks left in the year, and of course, those will be big holiday weeks. Of course, Christmas and then New Year's Eve, New Year's Day. So we will be taking a break from the program. We'll be back on the first Tuesday of 2015 with our program. But for the next 2 weeks, we'll be taking a break. So we're going to jam a lot into today's program. We have a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about the Chinese stock market, how it's done so well. Just a few weeks ago, probably 4 or 5 weeks ago, I told you on this program, in fact, we called the name of the program, It's Time to Buy China. Since then, Chinese stocks have risen dramatically. We'll talk about that in a later segment. We'll also be joined by Tom Cloud with an update on precious metals. I'll also provide you an update of what's been happening with the CIA torture report. You know, we hit that hard last week on last week's show. Going to have an update on that today on this program. But first, within hours of the world learning the gruesome details of this new CIA torture report, Congress rushes through yet another bill giving all U.S. intelligence agencies more power, not less, but more power than you can even imagine. What makes this unique is the fact that it is now codified into law. It is actually put in a bill and passed by the Congress. In essence, until now, this was a gray area, but now it is codified and it sits upon President Obama's desk waiting to be signed. In Section 309 in particular, the executive branch is given the awesome power under the Executive Order 12333 of warrantless collection and storage of any and all kinds of non-public, which is the government's way of saying private, American telephone or electronic communications with no express congressional oversight. This means that your home phones, your cell phones, your home and work computers, your tablets, any electronic device that connects to the world in any way is now open prey officially. It has been codified into law. Every move that you make online can now be tracked, traced, databased, analyzed, and stored by the executive branch of the U.S. federal government. The Congress considered this bill last week on Wednesday. Representative Justin Amash, one of the 100 congressmen who opposed the bill, called Section 309, quote, one of the most egregious sections of law that I've encountered during my time as a representative. And he added that the bill grants, quote, the executive branch virtually unlimited access to the communications of every American, unquote. This data, by the way, can now be stored by the federal government for up to 5 years, but the provision allows any non-public telephone or electronic communication sent by or among Americans to be intercepted by intelligence agencies without a court order, with no subpoena. And these communications can be stored for up to 5 years, but the legalese in the bill will allow indefinite storage in most cases. For example, if you encrypt your communications online, then they consider that to be a threat, and they will be able to hold your data for longer than 5 years. This information, by the way, will all be interpreted by the executive branch. That is, the bill gives practically carte blanche power to the executive branch to decide how to interpret the data. If they deem the data to be worthy, then the bill permits the executive branch to then send the data on to your local law enforcement agencies. There are no guidelines on how this works. It is completely. Instead, the executive branch will have total unencumbered discretion on what should be shared with other intelligence agencies or even your local police department. Do you hear what I'm saying to you, friends? Do you understand what is happening here? Within hours of the entire world learning the absolute gruesome details of this new CIA torture report, which many people say, Jerry, it's not torture. Well, I'll tell you, I stand by my statements that I made last week on this program that what I heard and what I read in that report constitutes torture. It's torture, and I stand by that. But within hours of the world learning these details about the CIA torture report, the Congress rushes through a bill giving even more power to the U.S. intelligence community, more power to the CIA, more power to the NSA. Not even a thought of whether or not they deserve more power. Not even a thought whether they are handing more power to potential war criminals within our government, on our payroll. Friends, the CIA, as they did those twisted things to the detainees, they did all of this on your dime. They work for you. So you actually, as an American citizen, have the right to decide whether or not you want the CIA to operate that way, and whether you want to give them even more power to watch what you're doing on the internet or listen to your phone calls without a court order. I would say that if anybody has that right to decide whether that is good or not, it would be you, the taxpayer, the one who pays for it, the one that they're claiming to protect. You should have a say in the matter. Now, why that is controversial, I have no clue. In most cases, when somebody is paying for something, they begin to show their concern about things, don't they? They really kind of get involved whenever they're paying for something. But in this case, the government has convinced us that, well, we're too stupid to figure out what's going on. We just need to trust our overlords. Just give them the power, give them the pliers, and give them the medieval torture tools, and let them go at it, and we'll just pay the bills. We'll just keep the lights on. Every now and then, someone with top-level access to our nation's surveillance techniques will speak out. Last July, that someone was John Napier Ty. He's a former section chief for Internet Freedom in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and he was there from January of 2011 to April of 2014 this year. And before leaving the U.S. State Department, Mr. Ty filed a complaint with the department's Inspector General claiming that the collection and storage methods being conducted under Executive Order 12333 were being committed in violation of the Fourth Amendment, which guarantees every single U.S. citizen the right to no unreasonable searches and seizures. Mr. Ty would later file similar complaints with the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, as well as the NSA Inspector General. According to an explosive article written by Mr. Ty in the Washington Post back in July, earlier this year, after he left the State Department, he says, quote, "This executive order, quote, authorizes collection of the content of communications, not just the metadata, even for U.S. persons," unquote. He added that it does not require that the affected U.S. persons be suspected of any wrongdoing and places no limits on the volume of communications by U.S. persons that may be collected and retained. You really should read the article that he wrote back in July if you missed it. I'm going to quote you a bit more of this article. Ty also says, quote, "When I started at the State Department, I took an oath to protect the Constitution of the United States. I don't believe that there is any valid interpretation of the Fourth Amendment that could permit the government to collect and store a large portion of U.S. citizens' online communications without any court or congressional oversight and without any suspicion of wrongdoing." Listen to this last sentence. "Such a legal regime risks abuse in the long run, regardless of whether one trusts the individuals in office at a particular moment." This is what I do not understand, friends. Why would you give this kind of power to the executive branch? I.e., think about the Patriot Act, this unpatriotic Patriot Act that we've had to deal with for so long, or the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which allows American citizens to be detained and held indefinitely without being charged. Now, friends, I don't consider myself a conspiracy theorist. Isn't that, by the way, how all conspiracy theorists start every sentence? Something like that. But I'm telling you that you need to face the facts. This is getting more grim by the day. The noose is tightening around the necks of the American people. The power that has been handed to the executive branch is the awesome power of gagging all opponents. Friends, do you not see what they're doing here? This is so obvious. It's as plain as the nose on your face. Within hours of the world learning that we use torture against detainees in the war on terror, a bill was passed that codified Executive Order 12333, giving the executive branch the awesome power of being able to snoop upon your internet communications, your telephone communications, and then to decide to share them based upon their discretion, not based upon any kind of court oversight, not based upon any kind of court opinion, not based upon any kind of congressional oversight. They get to decide whether the information that they have on you, that they have collected without a court order, because they're just browsing what you're doing, they could choose to share that data with your local law enforcement agencies. There is no legal process to guide their decisions. It is completely at the whims of the current leaders, listen to this, the current leaders within the executive branch. No congressional oversight, no new accountability. Now, I'm going to say this, and I don't want to come across, again, as a conspiracy theorist, but you've got to hear this. Isn't it possible that now the United States can take this data and use it to silence its own domestic enemies more so than ever before, because now that Congress has codified this, they've enshrined it into a bill and have passed it? Is that why we haven't heard a lot of dissent? Is that why we have Christian evangelical leaders on TV telling us that torture is not torture? Have these individuals received phone calls from deep within the executive branch letting them know that they have information on them that could take them down, and they better have a neutral position on this? I'm not saying that happened. I'm saying that it can happen. Maybe it already has happened, but it certainly could happen now. We know that they did this to Martin Luther King back in the 60s. We have all kinds of evidence going back how the CIA and the NSA have done all kinds of things to maintain power and have used private communications to, quote-unquote, blackmail individuals who were disagreeing with public policy that they were trying to push. I don't want to live under a government that can poke its nose in my business, who can look and see what I'm searching for online, who can listen to my phone calls and say, Jerry, this is old news. Everybody knows that. Edward Snowden told us. Friends, they just codified it. 3 days ago, they just passed a law that made it official, and the GOP did nothing to stop it. There was only one individual who made any kind of news. If you look this up and Google it, you won't find too much. Justin Amash, as I mentioned earlier, he was one of the only people. His staff actually caught it. All the way down in Section 309, there was an addition placed in allowing the executive branch to have complete and total legal authority to do this. Before, it's always been kind of a gray area. Now it's codified. Now it's signed. Now it's into law. Well, we're waiting for President Barack Obama to sign the law. But do you think that he's not going to, considering that it gives him a tremendous amount of new vast power against his enemies? America has completely politicized this CIA torture report. If you're against it, you're a liberal. If you're for it, then you're a patriot, right? If you're for torturing individuals, then you must be patriotic. Look, I'm not sitting around thinking about how much I like our enemies, okay? I'm not thinking about that. But I am thinking about the basics of human dignity and what we want to be as a country. And now that all of this information is coming out in black and white, Congress rushes through a new bill that gives absolute and total control to the executive branch legally to intercept your communications without a warrant and use it against you in a court of law without you ever even knowing and without any kind of legal process taking place. On our website today, we have a list of congressmen who voted for H.R. 4681. You'll be surprised who voted for it and perhaps who didn't. The House voted it through 325 to 100. I typically don't care too much about all of these bills. I mean, there's always junk in them, and there's always a bunch of bogus garbage that's in them. But when you have something this obvious coming within hours of the release of the CIA torture report, the Congress gives the CIA vast new powers and no accountability. After learning about this, you have to admit that something is wrong with our democracy. Something is wrong. But you can hop onto our website. Did your congressman vote for the H.R. 4681? Did he push that through even after hearing what was in Section 309, not requesting an amendment to that section, not requesting that be examined, but instead just voted yay and moved on to the next bill? Is that what your congressman did? You can find out on ftmdaily.com. As I mentioned, there's very few individuals speaking out about this at the upper levels of government. This week, I caught up with an individual who used to be deep within Washington's recesses of power. She was in the Chief of Staff's office at the Department of Homeland Security. She's a Harvard Law grad, and she is now serving as a legislative counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union, Miss Neema Singh Guliani. Here's my conversation with Miss Guliani. Neema, thank you so much for joining us on Follow the Money.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. When most Americans think of U.S. surveillance, Neema, we tend to think of the powers given to the executive branch under Section 215 of the Patriot Act. But there is another, perhaps more sinister set of executive surveillance powers that are conducted under a little-known Executive Order 12333 that gives the executive branch more access to private American communications and fewer legal restrictions. Why don't we begin with that? What is the difference between these two in layman's terms?
So what most people don't realize is that a large portion of our surveillance is actually conducted under this executive order. The executive order is decades old. It was created before we had the internet and before we had cell phones. And it was created to allow the president, upon his or her own authority, to conduct surveillance outside U.S. borders and that didn't target Americans. But what's happened is in our modern world, a lot of your communications and my communications are actually stored overseas. So, for example, when I email the person in the office next to me, that communication might be stored on a server in Europe, or it might be routed through Central America. And simply by using this executive order, the president and the executive can gather that information, and they're doing so without going through a court process and without any congressional authorization. And that's how it's fundamentally different from other types of surveillance that are conducted under the Patriot Act and other provisions in the law.
Now, that executive order received some attention last week as it was part of the Intelligence Authorization Act of 2015. From a simple reading of Section 309 of that bill, Neema, it appears that Congress may have actually, for the first time in my memory, been trying to impose some sort of legal constraint or legal restriction upon the data collection underneath that executive order. But you recently stated in an article, or actually in an interview, that the bill contains significant loopholes. What are these loopholes, and what do they mean to the average U.S. citizen listening to this broadcast?
Yeah, what's really key about the Executive Order 12333 is that information collected under it is done so without any congressional authorization and with no court oversight. And so what we saw last week was what appeared to be an attempt to place at least some restrictions on how long information collected under 12333 could be retained by the government. So basically, they tried to put in place a 5-year restriction. Unfortunately, though, those restrictions had numerous loopholes. So, for example, if there was information about a U.S. citizen to or from a U.S. citizen, and it discussed the foreign affairs of our government, it could be retained for longer than 5 years under one of those loopholes. Another major loophole was the fact that the information of non-U.S. citizens was not addressed at all. So if the government collects the communications of everyone, let's say in the UK or the Bahamas, the restriction would impose no limitations on how long that information could be kept. And so what we really saw was, even though there was a first step by Congress to put some restrictions on this very controversial authority, those restrictions are very weak. And it's very difficult to say, without knowing how the information is currently treated, whether there will actually be an improvement over current practice. And so what does that mean for you and I? It means that if our data or our communications are stored overseas, which is often the case in today's technology world, and the government, through the targeting of other people or through sort of mass collection, manages to get a hold of that data, they may be able to retain it for a minimum of 5 years, and even longer, even though you and I might have no relation to a criminal act or a terrorist act.
And that can be shared with local law enforcement officials, I would assume, by the executive branch at their discretion.
Yeah, one of the major loopholes in the restrictions proposed in the bill last week was that information could be kept for longer than 5 years if it was considered to be evidence of any crime. And so what we really see is this is a bleeding of activities that were meant to be to protect our national security, bleeding into domestic law enforcement, and really getting around the protections of the Fourth Amendment and other laws that would limit the ability of law enforcement to collect information without a warrant and without any cause.
This is such a slippery slope, Neema, and I know that you know this more than most because you've been focused on this for so long. But what does the average American citizen to think about this? I mean, what can he think about this? Does he have a voice in these matters? And if so, What can we as citizens do to protect ourselves, if anything?
You know, the first step is really to pressure members of Congress and the president to place restrictions on the use of Executive Order 12333. You know, in this day and age, it's really appalling when we think about the fact that the communications of Americans can be collected without a warrant, without a cause, and be retained for years and used by local law enforcement. And it's really the citizens need to tell their members of Congress and need to tell their elected officials, this isn't acceptable. We want change. We want restrictions on how these authorities can be used, because what the Fourth Amendment requires is that the government go to court and have a reason before they collect American information.
I know that there is the USA Freedom Act. Does that protect from the Executive Order 12333, or is that mainly targeting the Patriot Act itself?
No, the USA Freedom Act mainly targets the Patriot Act. It's very important because, as we all know, the Patriot Act has been abused to collect the information of all Americans. It collects the information of every call record, who we talk to, how long we talk to them, as well as other records. And so it's certainly a very important first step and absolutely necessary to protect Americans' privacy. But it is just the first step. You know, there's needs to be limits and more oversight for collection under Executive Order 12333. And frankly, there are other authorities, such as Section 702 of FISA, that also need to be reformed.
Neema, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate the hard work you're doing. Just keep it up and know that we appreciate what you do.
Right. Thank you so much.
Friends, many of your leaders in Washington are committing high treason against the United States Constitution, and they are doing it with the express permission of you, me, we the people. How? In the name of keeping you safe. This week, I am going on record yet once again to warn you that if these actions are allowed to stand, we are en route, if not already, in absolute tyranny. This is a testing hour. How will Americans respond when you take away all of their privacy? That's the question that the powers that be are eagerly waiting for the answer to. How many dissenters will emerge? And how far will the American people allow this out-of-control executive branch to go?
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. for I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. This administration intends to be candid about its errors, for as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it.
This government does not torture people. You know, we stick to U.S. law and our international obligations.
What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing.
My fellow Americans, this evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
You have to realize this is one of the great presidents, great military leaders. On his way out the door, at the end of his second term, he says, by the way, watch out for the military-industrial complex.
People know that he invented the phrase military-industrial complex, but very rarely do you see the whole thing and realize how utterly strident his warning was. I think it's one of the most profound statements ever made by an American president.
Just like George Washington gave his warnings about foreign entanglements and things like that, my dad was giving his warning against letting this military-industrial complex get out of hand.
We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.